Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm looking at the hotly anticipated LG 39GX950B, the first 39-inch ultrawide OLED gaming monitor with a 5K 2K resolution. This display is so anticipated because of its potential sweet spot size, coming in notably larger than 34-inch ultrawides that we've had for some time, but smaller than the massive 45-inch ultrawide that was LG's flagship in 2025. But this isn't LG's first attempt at the 39-inch format. They've been dabbling in this size with OLED options previously, and before that with LCDs as well. But those OLEDs in particular have fallen short of expectations on a couple of fronts. The previous model, the 39GX950B, packed just a 3440 by 1440 resolution, which is too low for a panel of this size. The new 2026 model bumps this up to 5120 by 2160. The old model used a crazy 800R curve that's been dialed back to 1500R for the new version, and the previous model used last generation WOLED technology, whereas the 39GX950B is a brand new tandem WOLED panel with all the benefits that brings to brightness and colors. Additional specs for this new model include a 165Hz refresh rate at 5120 by 2160, dual mode support that increases the refresh rate to 330Hz at 2560 by 1080, and display HDR True Black 500 certification. All of this comes at a hefty price tag of $1,800 US, making this one of the most expensive gaming monitors on the market right now. One of the best aspects to the 39GX950B is its size. A lot of the ultrawides that we've seen so far have used a standard 34-inch 21:9 format, which is equivalent to a 27-inch 16:9 monitor in height, but with 20 centimeters of additional width. It's a large panel with great width, but it doesn't have a lot of height, especially in an era where 32-inch 4K displays are becoming more popular. 39 inches in a 21:9 aspect ratio is a much better size for immersive gaming. We're now getting the same height as a 32-inch 16:9 monitor with 22 centimeters of additional width. It's the height that is a massive upgrade here, as it allows the screen to occupy much more of your vertical field of view. It's actually pretty wild how much difference 5 centimeters of height makes comparing 39 inches to 34-inch formats. But when you consider the 39-inch panel is 32% larger in area overall, it makes sense why it's a lot more immersive and impressive at a standard viewing distance. It's also not so large that it's difficult to fit on a desk. The even bigger 45-inch format, which is another 33% larger than this 39-inch panel, is pretty ridiculous with a width of over 1 meter. This 39-inch monitor is 92 centimeters wide, and while it's large, it feels a bit more manageable. It's smaller in width than most dual monitor setups, for example, making it a potentially suitable single screen alternative. The problem with previous 39-inch panels has been the resolution. 3440 by 1440 at 34 inches is fine. It's 110 ppi, which is in line with 27-inch 1440p class displays. But if you use that same resolution at 39 inches, which is exactly what LG did with the predecessor to this display, suddenly the ppi falls to just 96. Most people are not interested in a 32-inch 16:9 monitor with a 1440p resolution, instead demanding at least 4K on a screen of that size, and it's no different for 39-inch ultrawides. 1440p class is not good enough, 4K class is the minimum, and that's what we've gotten with this new 2026 model. A 5120 by 2160 resolution, resulting in 143 ppi. LG described this resolution as 5K 2K, but with a vertical height of 2160 and a similar ppi to 32-inch 4K monitors, this is actually a 4K class display. The upgraded resolution makes a massive difference to overall panel sharpness, especially for text and desktop applications. It's a near 50% increase in pixel density. That did wonders for the 45-inch panel, and it does wonders here as well. Text clarity is fantastic, similar to 32-inch 4K LCDs, games are super crisp, and you get a ton of pixel real estate for productivity apps. In addition, the new tandem WOLED panel uses an upgraded RGBB subpixel layout, the same layout used on LG Display's 32-inch 4K WOLEDs. The previous 39-inch panels used the unusual RWBG layout, which hurt text quality and had some issues with artifacts. That weird layout, combined with a lower pixel density, meant the old panel was not a very good choice for desktop apps and text rendering. With a huge boost to density and the new RGBB format, text clarity is now a solved issue. Another massive change LG Display have made is finally ditching the awful 800R curve they used across all previous WOLED ultrawide panels. This level of curvature was simply too curved. I didn't like it at all. I felt it made the image look too distorted, even on a panel of this width. Based on the comments I saw across our videos, it seems like most of you guys didn't like this level of curvature either, strongly preferring the 1800R or 1500R curves used on most other ultrawides. The new 39GX950B uses a 1500R curve, which is perfectly fine and much better than 800R. On ultrawides of this size, you do want some level of curve to assist with viewing the edges, similar to how with a dual screen setup you'd want to angle one or both of the screens inward a bit. 1500R is great for this size. It brings the edges in a bit closer to your eyes to help with visibility and immersion without being so curved that images on the screen look distorted. I found this monitor really pleasant to use, very similar to 1800R QD-OLED ultrawides, just with more overall screen real estate. The new curve strikes a great balance between desktop usability and gaming. The screen coating is perhaps the most controversial choice. LG Display told us at CES that this particular 39-inch panel is available in both a matte and glossy version. LG Electronics, the separate subsidiary that makes LG gaming monitors, opted to use the matte version for the 39GX950B. Gamers tend to have pretty strong preferences between matte and glossy, so a portion of you will be upset with LG's choice to use matte. Personally, I'm a fan of the WOLED glossy finish I've seen on other monitors, so to me the matte finish is a bit disappointing. I prefer the clarity and lack of light diffusion you get on the glossy coating, along with the sharper image thanks to the removal of coating grain. However, while I'd choose a glossy version of this monitor over a matte version, the matte coating is not a deal breaker, it's still very usable. The matte coating also has some advantages. The glossy coating on WOLEDs creates a mirror finish that can produce distracting reflections, especially in brighter environments. Using matte instead of glossy eliminates these defined mirror reflections and reduces distraction, so it's typically a better choice in brighter rooms. This can be especially useful if your room setup makes reflections unavoidable, like if there's a nearby window or something that casts light towards the screen. And while there is the addition of moderate coating grain, black levels and things like that are very similar on the matte and glossy finishes in dark rooms when light isn't directly hitting the screen. Moving now into motion performance. One of the most interesting choices LG Display made with this panel is the refresh rate limit, which is 165Hz in the 5K 2K mode. That's pretty low for a modern flagship monitor, especially considering 32-inch 4K equivalents hit 240Hz and the latest 34-inch QD OLEDs hit 360Hz. It's also a regression compared to the previous 39-inch WOLED, which hit 240Hz. This doesn't appear to be a limitation with ports, given there are multiple options that can achieve 5120 by 2160 at 240Hz with DSC. The refresh rate essentially dictates the motion clarity you get with an OLED monitor. This is because all OLEDs have extremely fast response times in the 0.3 millisecond range, so there's no difference in motion clarity when comparing two OLEDs at the same refresh rate. The only way you can get better motion clarity out of an OLED is to run it at a higher refresh rate, so the models with the highest refresh rate produce the best clarity. The 39GX950B topping out at 165Hz puts it at a disadvantage compared to other OLEDs when all are compared at their highest refresh. The fact OLEDs work like this has some pros and cons when we're talking about lower refresh rate models. The main con is pretty straightforward. If the game you're playing could be run at a frame rate above 165 FPS, motion clarity would be better if the monitor had a higher refresh rate. For example, a game that could be played at 200 FPS will look better on a 240Hz OLED than a 165Hz OLED. The main pro is that if you're gaming at a lower frame rate, there's no benefit to having a higher refresh rate. For example, if you're playing a game at 100 FPS, it doesn't matter whether the 39GX950B is a 165 or 240Hz display because the display would operate at 100Hz regardless. This is especially relevant given we're talking about a 5120 by 2160 resolution, which is difficult to run. It's 33% more pixels than regular 4K, so achieving above 165 FPS will be a challenge. If you primarily target 80 to 100 FPS in single-player titles, for example, the 165Hz refresh rate poses no limitation. However, these days there are a lot more options available in games that increase the frame rate. Running major titles at native 5K 2K will be difficult, but upscaling is very viable at this resolution, even using lower modes like performance. Depending on the game, this could send frame rates above 165 FPS. Then there's frame generation, which works best on super high refresh rate displays. With a 165Hz refresh rate, the maximum native render rate you can achieve is 82 FPS using the minimum 2x frame gen mode without exceeding the monitor's refresh rate and introducing tearing. This means on a 165Hz monitor with frame gen enabled, the latency experience caps out at around 80 FPS. This is really where a 240Hz refresh rate could have made a difference, as it would have allowed a render rate of up to 120 FPS with FrameGen. With all of these modern gaming options and the wide variety of games on the market, including lightweight indie titles and competitive games, I really think the 39GX950B should have been a 240Hz monitor. At a price tag of $1,800 US, this is a very expensive monitor, and for that price you should be getting the best. Now, this monitor does have dual mode support, which when enabled runs the screen at 2560 by 1080 at a refresh rate of 330Hz. This is a potentially useful option for fast-paced multiplayer games, but it's not a true substitute for a high native refresh rate, as it drops the resolution to something 1080p class. On a large 39-inch monitor, 2560 by 1080 doesn't look the best, the screen is definitely blurrier, so this mode is designed purely for gaming where better motion clarity is more important than a high resolution. While the resolution isn't amazing, dual mode does work very well. Switching between 5K 2K and 2560 by 1080 is seamless. It only changes the resolution and refresh rate. Every other aspect of the monitor's performance is identical. Colors are the same, HDR performance is the same, and input lag is still low. There's also a range of dual mode options, allowing you to display the 2560 by 1080 image across the entire screen or as a window of various sizes. On an OLED like this, 330Hz is also genuinely clearer than 165Hz, so there's definitely a benefit to using this mode. It's not something I personally found useful, but if I was more of a fast-paced competitive gamer where latency and clarity matter, it's something I'd consider using. It also makes the monitor more versatile with the ability to run a broader range of games. It isn't purely designed for single player. Input latency is low across all the modes, including SDR and HDR, both in the 5K 2K 165Hz configuration and in the 2560 by 1080 330Hz mode. I also found that the 60Hz mode had a low processing delay, so console gamers playing below the maximum refresh rate should still enjoy relatively low lag. The only real consideration with input lag on this monitor is the refresh rate itself. Higher refresh rates lead to lower latency and a more responsive experience, and as I said, 165Hz isn't a premium refresh rate these days, so relative to 240Hz monitors it's not as responsive, which you can see from this chart. As the 39GX950B is designed primarily for HDR gaming, HDR performance is very important. There are quite a few weird things about the various HDR configurations on this monitor, and unfortunately none of the modes offer a perfect, accurate experience. It may take some time to work through everything, so bear with me here. HDR is largely controlled through two settings, the picture mode and the peak brightness setting. What peak brightness does is pretty straightforward. Low caps the monitor to 800 nits, whereas high allows the monitor to run as high as 1400 to 1500 nits. In some modes, this results in changes to EOTF tracking as well. The picture mode, like Gamer 1 or Gamer 2, then controls other aspects such as overall EOTF tracking accuracy and color saturation. Some settings are also available to adjust in these modes, like brightness and color temperature, giving users some control over the final HDR output. Brightness is quite handy if you want to dim the HDR image, for example. The main options for gamers are the default Gamer 1 mode, the Gamer 2 mode, and the personalized picture mode, with either peak brightness set to high or low. Here's a quick breakdown of what each mode offers. All modes typically produce overbrightening to some degree, which means that when content requests a certain level of brightness, this monitor tends to overshoot that level and produce a higher level of brightness than it should. Here we're looking at dark scene accuracy. The Gamer 1 mode has the highest level of overbrightening, personalized picture is similar, and Gamer 2 has the least overbrightening. When you set peak brightness from low to high, both Gamer 1 and personalized picture increase the level of overbrightening in dark scenes, while unlocking the full brightness of the panel. Gamer 2's EOTF tracking remains similar, but with additional boosting in the higher brightness range to again hit the full brightness of the panel. No configuration here delivers amazing accuracy for dark scenes. In brighter scenes, the difference between each mode reduces, as the level of overbrightening in the Gamer 1 and personalized picture modes reduces. Gamer 2 still has the most accurate EOTF tracking when peak brightness is set to high, but the other modes look decent and similar enough to Gamer 2. However, there's a trade-off to Gamer 2's better EOTF tracking accuracy. This mode is oversaturated, whereas the Gamer 1 mode is somewhat undersaturated and personalized picture has the best color accuracy. Some people might like the extra vibrance that the Gamer 2 mode delivers, but I prefer the more natural colors of the personalized picture mode. What all of this means is there's no mode offering ideal accuracy, and there's trade-offs to each configuration. You can improve EOTF accuracy in some modes, turning peak brightness to low instead of high, but that costs you peak brightness. You can reduce overbrightening using Gamer 2, but that costs you color accuracy. My personal preference is using the personalized picture mode with peak brightness set to high. That's because Gamer 2 isn't significantly more accurate in EOTF tracking, but it is less accurate in colors. But wait, there's another trade-off. The personalized picture mode also disables DAS mode, as you can see in the OSD, and this increases input latency. In my testing, it only adds about 5 milliseconds of lag, which isn't too bad, but ideally this mode would still have the same low input latency of the other modes. I think LG could improve performance in the HDR modes through a firmware update. Really nailing down EOTF accuracy to reduce overbrightening in at least one of the modes would be ideal, and this should be done without adding oversaturation or input lag. Alternatively, LG could expose a saturation setting that users could adjust. While there are oddities across the various modes, performance is consistent whether we look at dark scene or bright scene test patterns. There doesn't appear to be much panel dimming, avoiding this major flaw of QD-OLED alternatives, though there seems to be a small amount of power management happening in very high APL content. Black Crush also wasn't an issue on my unit in HDR content with good dark level tracking. LG also offer a dynamic tone map setting, though this just raises brightness significantly and doesn't seem to have any other main benefits, so I wouldn't recommend using it. Color gamut coverage on this new 39-inch panel is the same as other tandem W OLEDs, 99.6% coverage of DCI-P3 and 82.8% coverage of Rec 2020. This gives it a slightly wider color space than the latest 360Hz QD OLEDs and similar coverage to other QD OLED models. Color volume, which factors in color brightness as well as color space, isn't as favorable to W OLEDs, as color brightness is limited on these panels relative to QD OLEDs. Tandem W OLED did introduce some improvements to this area, but we still end up with the best case MDC of around 18, which is lower than the 22 of QD OLEDs. Samsung's technology simply has higher color brightness than LG's tech, contributing to a larger color volume. Looking at HDR brightness, this latest WOLED panel produces close to the highest full-screen white brightness I've seen at 350 nits. This still isn't in the same class as mini LED LCDs, but it's higher than 34-inch QD OLEDs and 30 to 35% higher than previous WOLED ultrawides, including the 45-inch model. 10% window brightness is really strong as well, achieving 800 nits, which again beats out the field of contenders. 34-inch QD OLEDs only hit 450 to 500 nits in this metric, depending on the generation, and previous WOLEDs were slightly behind as well. Then at a 2% window size, I recorded brightness of 1400 nits when set to peak brightness high, which again is slightly higher than 360Hz 34-inch QD OLED models, and most other QD OLEDs, those top out at 1000 nits, so again it's much better than those models. What this leads to is strong performance in real scene brightness, delivering the highest brightness I've seen from an OLED ultrawide yet. I've seen up to 1100 nits in our test scenes, sometimes higher for even smaller elements, and an overall average of at least 600 nits when peak brightness is set to high. There are no real signs of panel dimming either in most scenes, with strong results regardless of whether we're testing high or low APL. This is a much stronger showing than the best QD OLEDs, like the MSI 341 CQR that uses the latest panel technology. While that monitor matches or slightly exceeds the 39GX950B in some tests, the brightest configuration has panel dimming that sees results fall well short of the 39GX950B in brighter scenes. This is why it only manages a 500 nit average. The 45GX950A isn't as bright either, and then older models are even further behind. Essentially, this is one of the brightest gaming OLEDs on the market, with a nice balance of performance between different types of scenes. One of the most talked about features on the 39GX950B is LG's new AI upscaling mode. LG claims this helps games and videos look sharper without requiring a GPU upgrade. How it works is pretty straightforward. Feed the monitor a non-native input signal like 2560 by 1080, enable AI upscaling, and it will upscale this signal to 5120 by 2160 using an algorithm that's more advanced than traditional display-side upscaling. I found it to work with all non-native signals that I've thrown at it, including stuff like 2560 by 1440 and including refresh rates like 120Hz. This feature is primarily designed for devices that cannot output 5K, 2K, or 4K. Anything that would normally max out at a 1080p output can be upscaled using a better algorithm and make use of the screen's higher resolution. To me, this makes the most sense on older consoles like the Nintendo Switch or some video players. However, AI upscaling is largely pointless on PC. Firstly, actually delivering a non-native signal to the monitor is difficult with the latest versions of Windows, as GPU scaling is almost always used. What this means is that if you change the resolution to something like 2560 by 1080 at 60Hz in Windows, it will keep the active signal mode at 5120 by 2160 and use GPU side scaling. You can't use AI upscaling at 5120 by 2160, so it becomes a bit difficult to use even if you wanted to, as you need to force Windows to deploy a lower active signal, just with the way Windows works these days. Secondly, using display-side upscaling is not the best way to play modern PC games. If you want more performance, you are much better off using features like DLSS to perform upscaling rather than AI upscaling on the monitor. For example, DLSS Performance mode at 5120 by 2160 uses a render resolution of 2560 by 1080, and this looks much better than feeding the 39GX950B a native 2560 by 1080 signal and then using AI upscaling on the monitor. If you were thinking this AI feature would be like having DLSS built into the monitor, that is not at all the case. It's not even close to modern temporal upscaling techniques and quality. Of course, not all games support upscaling features like DLSS, but the vast majority of newer games do support it, and newer games are more likely to be a challenge to run at 5K 2K. With older titles, chances are you can get a good experience at native 5K 2K with enough performance. On PC, I really only see this feature being useful for games that flat out do not support higher resolutions. When you do feed it a 1080p input signal, the AI upscaling feature is decent enough. I've had a lot of experience testing upscaling tech over on Hardware Unboxed. I've seen most of the modern techniques in action, and I describe LG's feature here as being a good spatial upscaler with a sharpening filter. It can have a bit of an oversharp look at times using the high mode, but this can help to reduce blur when you are upscaling 1080p to the panel's native resolution. However, this is not on the level of modern temporal techniques like DLSS, so again, it's not something I'd use for PC gaming. Next up, SDR Performance, and I recommend using the SDR mode for standard desktop apps and games that don't support HDR. Out of the box, this monitor has pretty standard levels of performance. Grayscale Delta E is average, color temperature is slightly cold but nothing too outrageous, and overall gamut is decent. The screen also provides the full gamut by default, so SDR, sRGB or Rec 709 content is oversaturated and this can affect skin tones. I should note here that this testing has been performed with AI scene optimization turned off, as that's a dynamic processing feature which is enabled by default. LG provide a great sRGB mode for the most part. While some settings are locked in this mode, you still have control over brightness and color temperature. Grayscale performance in the sRGB mode is pretty similar to the default Gamer 1 mode, but saturation is much improved, as now the screen is properly emulating Rec 709 colors. Overall color checker results are great, with a Delta E ITP of below 5.0, indicating this mode is well calibrated from the factory. You can also use Windows 11's auto color management feature to emulate sRGB, but I found the sRGB mode to produce better results. When we compare this to other monitors, the 39GX950B is a little below average in grayscale performance in the sRGB mode, though it's far from poor. Color checker is pretty good though. This monitor sits in the middle of the chart, offering similar performance to other flagship monitors. I wouldn't say this monitor has absolutely elite performance, like the AW3425DW, but the sRGB mode is pretty accurate and very usable. LG also offer hardware calibration. When you hook up the monitor over USB and use LG's calibration software, combined with the supported colorimeter, you can calibrate the screen and upload those results directly into the monitor scaler. This gives you a more accurate experience without having to worry about software profiles which aren't compatible with all applications. The way this calibration mode works isn't perfect and you don't always get full accuracy, but it's a great feature to have if you prioritize accuracy and already own calibration hardware. When you combine the solid sRGB mode performance with the flexible settings and hardware calibration support, I think LG have done a great job with the SDR mode overall. Performance can be improved further through a full software calibration, but out of the box, there are lots of options to get this display running nicely. The 39GX950B's SDR Brightness is very similar to what we've seen from 1440p tandem W OLEDs. After calibration, it hits 318 nits full screen white, with the uniform brightness mode enabled by default, and you can disable this if you want to. That's around the same mark as today's brand new 34-inch QD-OLED ultrawides, which hit 300 nits, and it's nearly 30% brighter than older OLED ultrawides. The previous 39-inch W OLED panel hit 252 nits, for example, so the shift to tandem W OLED is definitely delivering a brightness upgrade, even outperforming the 32-inch 4K panels. Minimum brightness is fine at 53 nits. Uniformity is a contentious issue with tandem W OLEDs due to something known as grey banding. This is a problem where ugly vertical bands are visible in dark grey content, hurting screen uniformity when viewing shadow detail, dark HDR scenes, or applications with a dark interface. Grey uniformity has been a problem with WOLEDs for a while, in contrast to QD-OLEDs which typically have no uniformity issues, but in the tandem WOLED era, things have gotten worse. The good news is that grey banding is typically worse on higher refresh rate models. With this monitor only being 165Hz compared to 280 or even 540Hz on other tandem W OLEDs, grey banding is already less likely to be visible. On my unit, I didn't think banding was problematic at all really. It was less prevalent than the already okay results I saw across a range of 280Hz models, so at least in my case, this inherent flaw to W OLED does not cause annoying disturbances viewing dark content. Unfortunately though, grey banding is a bit of a panel lottery. You might get a good unit like what I'm showing here, or you might get a unit with particularly bad banding. I'm not sure how bad the lottery will be on the 39-inch panel. We'll have to wait for user reports to see what these panels are like in general in the wild. But if you are planning on purchasing this display, it's definitely something to be aware of. In better news, white uniformity is perfectly fine on my unit, so when viewing lighter content, there are no concerns whatsoever. This is a pretty uniform display. Power consumption is surprisingly low on the 39GX950B displaying full white. Despite being larger than 32-inch 4K W OLEDs, power consumption is similar at 67 watts, which is likely due to the use of more efficient tandem W OLED tech. Power consumption is slightly lower than the previous gen 39GS95QE at a similar size, and below that of 34-inch QD OLEDs due to the white sub-pixel advantage. However, while gaming, power consumption is a bit higher than other models, as we're no longer just relying on the white sub-pixel. In my testing, the 39GX950B uses slightly less power than the 45-inch model, but less than 10 watts more than the 32-inch W OLEDs and 34-inch QD OLEDs. At its peak, power consumption can be high on a 39-inch OLED, but these results are not ridiculous. For port selection, we have one DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 port, two HDMI 2.1 48GB per second ports, a USB-C input with DP alt mode and 90 watts of power delivery, and a 2-port USB hub which uses the USB-C for upstream. All ports are capable of 5120x2160 at 10-bit 165Hz, and of course there's support for console-like resolutions such as 3840x2160. The 39GX950B packs an OK feature set with various options accessible through the directional OSD toggle at the bottom of the rear panel. There's a good set of color controls and some gaming specific stuff like black boosting, crosshairs, and an FPS counter. That's in addition to the AI stuff I talked about earlier. Where this monitor falls a bit short is it doesn't have some of the useful additions we've seen in flagship OLEDs over the last year or so. There's no black frame insertion mode, no anti-flicker setting, no proximity sensor, no DSC toggle, and no cave game switch. I wouldn't say any of these are deal breakers to not include, but these days what LG offers is on the more basic end of the spectrum. OLED panels of all varieties are susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burn-in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day, and you can check out our ongoing OLED burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a gaming monitor for hours of work. The LG 39GX950B is a bit weaker than normal on the burn-in front. There's minimal customizability around the OLED care features, only offering an on-off toggle for the screensaver, along with the ability to manually run the pixel cleaner. They've even removed the controls around pixel moving compared to previous models. LG also only offer a 2-year warranty, which makes no specific mention of burn-in, only saying the warranty covers the OLED display panel, which is below the industry standard for OLED warranties in both length and specificity. Now, LG have told us previously this warranty does cover burn-in, but that's kind of a trust me bro situation, and I strongly believe this should be clearly written on their website if it was the case. The overall design of this monitor is very similar to the larger 45GX950A model from last year, with some small tweaks and a reduction in curvature. The base is still a flat, relatively thin metal slab, which is excellent because it doesn't take up that much desk space, a surprise for a monitor that's so large, and its profile means you can put items on top of it with ease. Extending from that is the wide stand pillar, which uses plastic for its outer surfaces and supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustment. The maximum height on offer is very good, so this should be a comfortable monitor to use in most desk setups without needing to resort to a monitor arm. My only real concern with this design is the stand is a bit wobbly, something that does tend to plague larger ultrawides due to the size of the panel. It's not so much an issue with the metal stand, which is definitely sufficient and provides good stability, it's more due to the connection between the stand and the display. Aesthetically, I like the slim bezels on all 4 sides with no obvious chin. The rear is a uniform panel with a minimalist design constructed from mid-grey plastic and an RGB LED light bar that runs around the port area and stand connection. It's a good-looking product with decent build quality. Overall, the LG 39GX950B is a fantastic ultra-wide gaming monitor, finally delivering a high-quality OLED option at this sought-after size. It's not a flawless product, and there are some mildly annoying quirks about its performance, but on the whole, as a flagship immersive display, this is a product that I can recommend. There are many great aspects to this monitor, but the best is probably its size. It's 32% larger than 34-inch ultrawides and adds a crucial amount of height, putting it on par with 32-inch 4K displays. It's a bigger, more enjoyable panel format than 34-inch models, without being so large that it's uncomfortable to use and hard to fit on a desk. I think this is a sweet spot size for high-end ultrawide gaming. But we've had ultrawides of this size before. In fact, we've had 39-inch WOLEDs before, so why is this one something I can now recommend? It's because LG have fixed many deal-breaker problems I had with the previous gen model. The 800R curve, gone, replaced with the much nicer 1500R. The low 3440 by 1440 resolution, gone, upgraded to 5120 by 2160, significantly improving text rendering and clarity. The weird subpixel layout, gone, improved to RGWB. And the upgrade to the latest tandem WOLED technology brings with it a large suite of improvements to performance and image quality. This new panel is much brighter than previous WOLED ultrawides, now easily pushing over 1000 nits in HDR content to go along with over 300 nits of full-screen SDR brightness. In fact, it's one of the brightest OLED monitors I've tested, beating the brand new 34-inch 360Hz QD-OLED ultrawide and beating all 32-inch 4K OLEDs using either technology. Color gamut is noticeably better than previous gen WOLEDs, and there's no panel dimming problem like we see from QD-OLEDs, so brightness performance is consistently good in the same mode whether we're viewing dark or bright scenes. For all types of gaming, but particularly HDR gaming, the 39GX950B looks excellent. Great motion clarity from super fast response times, high brightness, deep zero-level blacks, per pixel control, a fantastic resolution that produces crisp visuals, and it's simply a very large panel that's fun to use. In other areas of performance, I was happy with LG's SDR calibration, especially in the sRGB mode, along with a good set of controls and support for hardware calibration. Uniformity was decent with minimal dark grey banding on my unit. Dual mode works well, providing a 330Hz experience at 2560 by 1080 for competitive gaming, and the AI upscaling mode is a good addition for input devices that can't natively output 4K. So what are the catches here? What are the drawbacks to the 39GX950B? Well, some areas to performance are not as strong as I'd like. HDR calibration needs some work, it's definitely usable, but there's no mode that has optimal performance, you only get bits and pieces here and there. OLED care options are very limited, I'd say basically non-existent, and LG have not implemented some of the more advanced gaming features we're starting to see like anti-flicker modes. The AI upscaling mode, again, it's not particularly useful for PC gaming. That's the more trivial stuff though. In terms of bigger issues, one deal breaker for some buyers will be the matte screen coating. I think it's fine and certainly very usable, especially in brighter rooms, but if you have a strong preference for glossy OLED, this monitor won't be for you. With that said, as this is a WOLED, you don't have to worry about ambient light in your room raising blacks and making the screen look a bit grey or purple. That's an issue with QD-OLED, not WOLED, so even with the matte coating, black levels are great in all environments. I think the biggest concern I have is the refresh rate, which is 165Hz at 5120 by 2160. Look, I mean, it's certainly a fine and usable refresh rate considering it's a high resolution, but it's on the low side for a flagship gaming monitor in 2026. At a 34-inch size, we're now getting up to a 360Hz refresh rate, albeit at 3440 by 1440, and 32-inch 4K screens have been 240Hz for several years now. This really should be a 240Hz display as well, especially for the price. And that's the big elephant in the room. The 39GX950B is an extremely expensive monitor, even factoring in its unique feature set and generally good levels of performance. It's $1,800 US, making it one of the most expensive gaming monitors, just $200 less than the launch price of the 45-inch model. That is really crazy, and it does make it hard to justify. For comparison, right now, you can get a flagship best of the best 34-inch QD OLED for $1,100 to $1,200 US. This 39-inch model is a whopping 50% more expensive. That's a much larger premium to get a larger screen than we usually see. And realistically, you can get a great 34-inch 240Hz OLED like the Alienware AW3425DW for just $730, making this new LG model 147% more expensive. Yes, it's a great monitor, but the price tag is absurd. Now, if you're really set on a 39-inch 5K 2K ultrawide for gaming and have lots of disposable income to spend on a product with a flagship price, Yeah, absolutely get the 39GX950B for $1,800 and have a great time with it. Just be aware, you're paying a big flagship tax, kind of like buying an RTX 5090, which you'll probably need for this monitor. But what I'd really recommend is waiting. The 45-inch model launched in April 2025 for $2,000 US, but it was discounted to $1,600 as soon as October of that year. Maybe the 39-inch variant will be in higher demand, so it won't be discounted as quickly or to the same extent, but sizable discounts seem to be pretty common across LG's lineup, so I'd just wait for it to get cheaper. So anyway, that's it for this long review of this LG 39-inch WOLED Ultrawide. Hopefully there's everything that you need to know about this monitor in this video, so you can go ahead and decide whether you want to buy one or not, or maybe you're just interested in this monitor and wanted to know how, monitor technology is progressing and all that sort of thing. If you do want to buy this monitor, we have links to it in the description below. Down there, you can also sign up to our Patreon if you want to support the channel directly and support our independent testing. It takes a lot of time and effort to put these videos together, so we really appreciate everyone who is a Patreon member that allows us to dedicate so much time to this. So yeah, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.